Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So make sure you're in the right place. This is Language at the Core, why all students need academic language development. And this is designed for grades 6 through 12. My name is Gina Chavez. I'm the director of the California Reading and Literature Project at Cal State Los Angeles. And I'm here with Deborah.
Okay, so I'm Debbie Costa Hernandez, and I am the California Reading and Literature Project Executive Director, statewide office. Pleasure to be here.
So technically, she's my boss.
Just technically.
Just technically. But she's nice, so. Okay, so you saw this wonderful graphic this morning, and this shows you all the themes, and really is that graphic organizer about the framework. And let's see if our beautiful animation works. So recognizing that we know all these themes work together and they overlap. And your session right now is on language development. Language development. So we're looking at language at the core. So just so we can get an idea of who's in the room. And judging from the general session, we didn't have too many teachers. So let me start with teachers. If you are a classroom teacher.
Yes.
Yay, we have more. Wonderful. Great, great, great. And if you are support, any kind of support, a TOSA, instructional support, excellent, excellent. How about site administrators? Okay. And district administrators? Wonderful. Okay, so it looks like we're mainly teachers and support, so we're really looking at, probably want to look at instruction, but as you heard this morning, we're providing a general overview of this theme in the framework. Our time is short, so we're going to look quickly at some resources that you'll have in the framework in this theme. And it's not going to be a real deep examination, but our goal is to get to a vignette so that you can see a vignette. That's where you'll see the most instructional and strategies. Although we're not focused on strategies, we'll look at one. We're looking big picture through the lens of language. So you saw the graphic with the circles going around with the different themes. And we know our themes are content, knowledge, foundational skills, effective expression, and I'm missing one, content knowledge. So just for a moment, think, why did language development emerge as its own theme with the same level of importance as those other themes? Why do you think language development is so important? And what are your thoughts about that? Anyone? We'll go, whoa, that was 4 altogether. 1, 2, 3, 4.
You can't manipulate the content without language or the literacy behind the content.
Okay, and then I think over here.
You need to have a certain understanding of the language to make meaning.
Great. And I think it was right here. Deborah, did you have a comment? So you can summarize what they said.
Yes, I think language development is how they access the content and the curriculum. Definitely. It has to be in place.
And then right here with the turquoise.
Ditto, as well as allowing students to show their knowledge as well.
Okay, so I heard a lot of different things, accessing the content, showing the content, discussing. So if you look at our next slide, it's all here. Language is really embedded in all of the strands of the standards. It's embedded in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. It's all throughout the English language development standards in those 3 parts: interacting in meaningful ways, understanding how English works, and using foundational skills. All of that requires a language base. All the themes in the framework require that language base. And then in the framework, we're really looking at promoting and increasing language proficiency and sophistication. So when I was a very young teacher, over 20 years ago, the analogy I was given was that reading and writing are like 2 boats that sit on a sea of oral language. So you have to have a broad base of language in order for those two boats to sit. So we could even add other boats that say content knowledge and meaning making and effective expression. You have to have a lot of language to start with in order to perform in those areas. So at the 6-8 level, I think we're missing a word. Should that say build on? The 6th through 8th grade standards build. I think there should be an on. Since this is language, should that be on or upon? But you
Build
get it.
on, yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you. So knowing that that started in TK5, so we're just continuing, yes? And we want to increase the breadth and complexity of the language skills. The breadth and complexity. Complexity is the word that always stands out to me, is how do I do that? So let's take a look at a standard, 6th through 8th grade. So notice that this is reading literature, reading informational text, 6th through 8th. Determine cognitive, figurative, and the technical meaning of words and phrases, analyzing the impact of those word choices. So think about that for a moment. What's the language demand there? So this is what you're trying to achieve with students. What do they have to be able to do with the language? Basic meaning. So they've got to have that first, then the connotation. Great. I heard something else. What else? So thinking of the analogies or allusions to other texts, how might they demonstrate that? So notice the bottom, the standards that we're looking at. Here's an example, again, 8th grade. So take a moment to read that one.
They're all in the room.
So here we're looking at sentence patterns, expressing ideas precisely. This is interesting, while eliminating wordiness. Okay, that's a tough one because I talk a lot. So think again, what are we asking students to do with language here? Yeah.
I was just going to say that this demands that they have multiple tools in the toolbox to way to place them.
Yes.
And they're deciding on which
Yes.
is the most appropriate concision, whatever, for whatever context.
Yes.
And so if you're going to vary your language for context, that means you need to have lots of different resources available.
Yes.
I know, and as English speakers, we do that, and it's not very transparent. We just do it. You do it depending on the context, and I know that I do it when I notice that someone doesn't understand me. I switch right away. Let me say it this way, or let me do this. But I don't consciously say, now I'm going to use this strategy. Now I'm going to use this, or I'm going to do this. But you're right. You've got to have all those tools right in your back pocket.
And if I can say on Appendix B, which is going to be a chapter of the ELD standards, and it talks about the kind of feedback that this type of requirement, what this requires when we're providing feedback for students in their writing is that you're not going to give them feedback to make their writing more interesting. It's not about making more interesting. It's about making it more engaging, more concise, more precise, right? So that's it changes even what the kind of feedback and how we work with students in their writing and in their speaking as well.
So what Debbie just said, I think we highlighted right here, pulled right out of there. Engaging, multiple meanings. How do I access that immediately when I need to? So again, more language embedded in the standards. And here's our last example. Applying knowledge of the language to understand how language functions. And I'll never forget, I was giving an oral language test to I think she was 4th grade. And she caught on that I was testing her sentence structures and syntax. And so after when we were looking at her performance, she asked right away, did I get that one? Did I say it right? How do I say it? And she wanted, this was a testing situation, she wanted instruction right then because it became apparent to her that there are certain ways that we say things. And after that I heard, since I wasn't her teacher, but after that I heard that language awareness button just clicked on her in her mind immediately. And she was constantly after that asking, did I say it correctly? Did I use the right word? Is that the right sentence? So really looking at the language awareness, having students be aware of the language that they're using.
So as you can see, is the mic on? Just want to check. Okay, as you can see in the sample of the standards that we highlighted, in the framework, language development, is academic language development encompasses four important key ideas. One is it's about vocabulary development, and you saw some of that in the standards, right? But in many places, when we talk about academic language development, that's where people stop. They said it's about vocabulary, and it's not sufficient. We're also talking about building students' grammatical and discourse understanding, how to compose different grammatical structures to convey different ideas, not only at the sentence level, but at the text level. It's also about, this is important in the framework, it's about this language awareness, a meta-linguistic awareness, understanding how language works. And the metaphor, the analogy that best works for me is to think of a magician and taking the kids to behind the curtain to see how they perform the tricks. And so what you see here is not magic, it's tricks. And this is what the magician knows. The magician knows that the brain is expecting to see something and they play with that. The magician knows that your eyes move in a certain way and that's why they do the trick in this way. The magicians know that people want this to work, so they do it this way. So you take them behind the curtains and you reveal for the students and help the students understand, how is it that writers use language? How is it that authors use language? How is it that educated people use language to convey, to communicate, to convey ideas, right? The academic language development is the theme of academic language development. It's for all students. All students. Now, ELD standards, it didn't do it. I had my animation that amplified the ELD point, but not here, so you missed it. The ELD standards then amplify, augment the emphasis on language development and language awareness for English learners. Okay, so it's not as a way to dumb down or water down the language, it amplifies and supports this focus on language, academic language for all students. But when we're talking about this theme of academic language development, I want you to think of all students, including our English learners and some of our standard English learners who don't get an assessment or official label, but that we know for them, academic language is also a second language or another language, and we need to work with them. And when we talk about English learners, we need to keep in mind that our English learners are learning content through English, are learning to use English, are learning about how English works simultaneously in our classrooms, in our schools. So ELD, or English Language Development, is that unifying force, is what helps the students or helps the teacher plan for students access, support for learning content through English, learning how to use English to express what they know about that content, and also understand how English works. This behind the scenes look at, okay, how is it that they use it to convey these ideas? Why do they organize text in that way? What are the tricks they have? And how can I own those same tricks? So it's after lunch, and that carb load from the sandwiches, right? The blood is kind of all around here. I can sense it. So rather than a quick write, what I'd like you to do is very quickly, with the person behind you, next to you, talk about what is your definition of academic language? How do you define academic language? Very quickly, 30 seconds. Turn, talk. So what I'd like you to read, you're getting a handout is yellow. So you're going to go to figure 212. And here's your purpose for reading. And it's going to be a very quick glance at the text. Your purpose for reading is how does the framework's description of academic language matches up against your definition of academic language? Right? Your purpose for reading is to compare how does the framework's definition of academic language or description of academic language matches up to your definition of academic language. And 1 minute. So I'm going to ask you to stand and find a person from the other side of the room. So from this half, you're going to find a person from this half. Find one person and share how did you find that this definition or description of academic language compared to your initial definition of academic language. But you need to pay attention when I raise my hand. This is the signal to come back to your seat. I'm not going to say anything, so I'm going to raise my hand when it's time to come back to your seat. Ready? So can you please stand and find a person from the other side of the room and share your ideas? Can I have a couple of ideas of something that maybe you already had in your own definition and found validation in this text, or something that is perhaps more explicit than you thought, or something new to you can add to your own definition of academic language? Yes, please.
My partner Mary Barbara and I were discussing that originally we were looking at academic language as academic vocabulary, not necessarily content specific, but now I can see that they're doing more as academic language and not just vocabulary. Vocabulary is a part.
Vocabulary is a part, not just all. And I had that idea too, and I thought the 3 tiers of vocabulary, especially tier 2 and tier 3, but is much bigger, much broader than vocabulary. Thank you. Somebody else? Who wants to please? Across all subjects. The shared responsibility for language development. Everyone, all hands on deck. All hands on deck. Because if you saw the level of sophistication that the standards are asking us for, right? It can't be just one teacher. It's all hands on deck for that. Anybody else? One last comment. Something that caught your attention in this description of academic language. Please. Audience and purpose. There's a purpose for using academic language. And that's important because language is social. Our learning is social. And so that is important to keep in mind because we're not talking about teaching academic language in isolation. We're not going to be teaching grammar in isolation. It's all about embedded in the content that we're teaching, but we're very intentional about the language that we're using and the language that the students are going to use to share what they are learning. So I just want to highlight, I'm sure you highlighted it, but make sure that we hone in on 3 things. On the second paragraph, right in the middle, where it says, however, academic English encompasses much more than vocabulary. In school and other settings, students choose particular language resources in order to meet the expectations of the people with whom they are interacting, which is what you shared. The next paragraph, first sentence, from this perspective, language is a meaning-making resource. And academic English encompasses discourse practices, text structures, grammatical structures, and vocabulary, all inseparable from meaning. And in the last paragraph, the first sentence, not all children come to school equally prepared to engage with academic English. However, all students can learn academic English, use it to achieve success in academic tasks across the disciplines, and build upon it to prepare for college and careers. And that, if you can highlight it, underline it, amplify it, frame it, because that's important. Because many of us, not in your districts, not in your schools, but we've interacted with colleagues who can identify and tell us what the kids are lacking. And our students don't have academic language, and that's why they struggle. The difference is the division of this framework is that we can teach it, and they can learn it. And where is that going to happen? Where are they going to learn academic language? In school. And it's not going to be by accident. It has to be intentional, purposeful, planned. Right? So the next piece, we're going to read, and some of you alluded to this already, but if you recall, how many of you recall BICS and CALP? Basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. So people talk about language, social language, and academic language. And I think that framework served us for a while, for us to understand why is it that some students that sound proficient in English are not succeeding in school. Right? That's what that framework, that's what Commons came out with that framework, because he wanted to explain to us that what we were hearing was the social language. But in order to be successful in school, they needed academic language. Now, we need to move that forward. And now understand that there's not this dichotomy. It's not social versus academic. It's about audience, task, linguistic resources. It's about register. So the next piece that you're going to read is figure 2.14. And this is a short one. And your purpose for reading is to identify 2 or 3 key ideas, key takeaways from this discussion about register. And we have about 2 minutes for this. So can I hear from a couple of you, what did you highlight as an important point to remember or take away from this discussion about register?
The characteristics, I'm a teacher, I'm not used to a mic, of these academic registers, which are critical for school success, include specialized and technical vocabulary, sentences and clauses that are densely packed, and on to the end of that sentence.
Raise your hand if you found that to be an MIP for you as well. Thank you. Another MIP for somebody else. Please.
The grammatical patterns that are found in specific disciplines, just for myself, recognizing that, and I think where it says the teacher, if a teacher has to recognize this themselves to be effective, very, very powerful for me.
Raise your hand if you also identify that as one of your MIPs. Can I hear from a third person? Please.
That register is the relationship between contents, the audience, and the relationship between the speaker and the audience, and that the teacher provides many opportunities to practice in these different registers so that students can choose which is the most appropriate register at the most appropriate time.
Thank you. How many of you identify that as an MIP for you as well? Thank you. So if you see the difference between talking about either or, social or academic, and talking about adjusting to audience, task, context, very different, right? But the smarter people I know are able to do that seamlessly. They move from being with friends and talking one way and being in a professional setting and talking in a different way with colleagues in an informal way, but in the work setting and talking, making presentations, or even in their writing. They are able to adjust, and they have all the linguistic tools to do that. So I thought that just to keep our brains, like the blood going back to the brain, because I know mine is fighting right now with gravity. I thought that we'd do something a little fun. So let's play with register for just maybe a minute. So I'm going to give you a statement, and I want you to change the register to a more formal academic register. So the statement is, he thinks he's all that, but I have news for him, he isn't. That's the statement. He thinks he's all that. But I have news for him. He isn't. Change it to an academic register. Change it to a formal register. Write that statement into a more academic. So he thinks he's all that. But I have news for him. He isn't. See if you can do it with the same attitude, like he isn't. Okay, who wants to try? Who wants to try? We have one in the back. If you start laughing first.
They got even went less formal.
They got less formal? No, it was in the other direction. Who wants to share? We have one person to share here.
That gentleman is quite arrogant, and I feel the need to deflate his ego somewhat.
That gentleman is a big arrogant. I feel the need to deflate his ego.
His opinion of himself is misguided.
His opinion of himself is misguided. Anyone wants to try another one? One here and one. Oh, it's all women. Excuse me. Yes, please.
His self-impression is grandiose. His public projection is contrived.
Can you repeat it again? His
Self-impression is grandiose. His public projection is contrived.
is contrived. Beautiful. And in the back?
A certain young man has an inflated opinion of himself, however, is seriously mistaken.
Beautiful. Now, all of you up the register to a formal register, right? Did you all use the same vocabulary? Did you all use the same grammatical structures? In fact, I think everybody used a different grammatical structure. That's the difference. Those are the skills we want our kids to have. The ability to move from an informal to a formal register seamlessly, just like you did. You require vocabulary, knowledge about vocabulary and knowledge about grammatical structure, and they were at your disposal because you had 30 seconds and you were able to do it. So that's the goal. Okay, I tried one, and it was his appraisal of self-worth is misguided. Somebody has to tell me. Thank you. So, and then my next slides are mostly a summary of what we just read, just to re-emphasize that academic registers include very specialized in tech vocabulary, a variety of sentences that are densely packed with meaning. The text that is structured in different ways. Who knows what hedging language is? Anyone knows what hedging language? Like hedge. In science, this is an example. In science, when you're research, the statements usually go by like research suggests, findings point to. It's never a definite. Kind of around the edges, they hedging language because there's always the assumption that you can prove that point, that you can prove that wrong, that you can find even more. So it's never, this is what it is this is what research suggests. And that's important for students to understand that. As an example, so what we just talked about, we make these switches, we make this easily because we have the tools. And for many of our English learners and standard English learners, these tools are not available. So they don't always know how to do this automatically. So our task is to help them do explicitly what we can do implicitly, like we just did. And then this is more about registers and vocabulary and how important it is to engage students in conversation and dialogue. It's not about teaching grammar in isolation. It's all about giving the kids the opportunities to use the language and elevate their language. And I don't know about you, how many of you are in supporting roles? You coach, teachers. I've done some coaching, and I can't tell you how many times I walk into a classroom and the teacher is using beautiful academic language. And the students are not. Right? So it's one part of it is teachers modeling, intentionally modeling the use of that language, but it does the students no good if there aren't planned opportunities, and I emphasize planned opportunities for them to engage in using that language. And it's not about answering incomplete sentences. That's not it. It's engaging in the type of discourse that we find in books, that we find at the college level, right? That can only happen in school, because at home we don't talk that way. So, and this about grammatical understandings, you got all that. And I just want to highlight in this one, this last bullet that is so important, because we're talking about this focus on metalinguistic awareness in this framework, vocabulary, grammatical, and text understanding, and metalinguistic awareness. We have to help students develop the language to talk about language.
Okay, so as we're talking about vocabulary development, thinking about this multifaceted approach to vocabulary, I want you to, again, think of something you do as you support teachers or as you observe classrooms. Think of a strategy or an instructional point where you see explicit vocabulary instruction and context. Or think about how you might instruct or observe for generative word learning strategies. The third one is wide reading. How do you use wide reading to support vocabulary instruction? And then the fourth one is metalinguistic awareness. What strategies or observations have you seen with metalinguistic awareness? So I want you to think of one in either 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then we're going to share out in those different categories. Does that make sense? So try to think of an instructional strategy or something you've seen in one of these 4 areas. Could be a workshop you provided, could be PD, could be something you've seen a teacher do. All right, so let's hear some ideas. What is something that you've seen or supported in, let's go from the bottom up, metalinguistic awareness? Have you seen anything, instruction?
One of the things that we've been working on at our site is just for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And we've had our teachers actually get together within their departments and come up with a common list that they would like them to see, and then our ELD teachers have been supporting them through creating sentence frames. So you've got those tier 3 words that they need to know, but then those tier 2 words are also pretty necessary in order for them to access the curriculum.
Were you summarizing bullet number 1? Yes, you are.
I am.
Yes, absolutely. That's perfect. Great. What's another way? How about wide reading? How would we use wide reading to support vocabulary instruction? Something you've seen or something that you've helped teachers with? That seems to be the tough one. Yes?
I'm sorry, I just don't know what wide reading is.
Oh gosh, wide reading in all genres, reading informational text, reading narrative text, help me, reading articles, reading.
Just promoting in students that they have to read beyond what's in front of them for class. So how do we help the students develop this desire, motivation to read? Because the wide reading, it is the way they build vocabulary faster. The more you read, the more vocabulary you gain, because you see it in multiple settings, meaning slightly different things, the same words that you've been seeing over and over again. So that's why reading is categorized as a vocabulary learning strategy, because it's an opportunity for them to see it in the context of different texts at different times.
Okay. I do it by theme,
Okay.
theme units, and we come up with an overall theme, and with my language learners, I'd probably have to, we'd go to News ELA. If you've ever heard of News ELA, you can change the Lexile levels, and you can do that with ELD. I do have newcomers, so it's kind of hard for that level, but some of the kids that we want to challenge and try to move into the next levels, we try to do that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
definitely. And I saw a hand in the back.
Oh, I was just going to say that when you take a piece of like a topic and saying, here it is in a poetic form about this particular topic, and here it is in informational text, or looking at film of something compared to, but isn't that also schools use accelerated reader to get kids to read a vast volume of things so that they're exposed to a lot of text over the course of their academic career?
Yes.
Anything else? So just along with what you were saying, just within wide reading, you might have students look at a word and how it's used differently in all those different types of reading, like evaluate. What does evaluate mean in math? What does evaluate mean in science? And it can be slightly different. So we want that wide reading so they can see the word over and over again, and then also start to get a sense of it means slightly different here and slightly different here and slightly different here.
Yeah, when I do my vocabulary, they also have to do all the different forms of the word.
Yes.
So it's not just evaluate, it's evaluation,
Yes.
evaluator. It helps them when they go into another setting, or if they're seeing it on testing, because unfortunately, but also that our ELD students are being tested at state levels. And so when they see evaluation, even though it's a cognate, it doesn't throw them off.
Right.
Because it's no longer the Bloom's taxonomy word
Right.
that we usually use.
Right.
For, explain. Well, what's the explanation?
Exactly.
They don't just get thrown off by the TION.
Exactly. So actually, you're also talking about number 2, generative word strategies, is using the word form and showing that. And a lot of times it's exactly what you said, just to help relieve that anxiety that, oh my gosh, I see evaluate. Is that the word that I know? Is that evaluation the way I know it? To just bridge that. So any other ideas around generative word learning?
I did it by having them break down the word, like into the base word or the...
Yes.
I forgot the other term for it. Because when they see that there's actually a suffix and a prefix, and they actually see just the word by itself, they get it. They're like, oh, I know that word.
Yes.
So when you have them, basically cloister it off, it's easier for them to understand.
Yeah, and that way they can latch onto something known. They know that, lowers the anxiety. We all know about that, lowering the anxiety, and that way it's not totally new. No, you do know this part, now let's figure out the rest.
And the other piece about, and that's why it's called a generative word learning strategy, because it helps you build, not only understand the meaning of a word, but build vocabulary, because the next time I see TION, I know what it means, so applied to a new root word, I can now understand, ballpark the meaning of this new word that I've never seen in my life before, and then I can use context to confirm whether that is in fact what it means. Or I can use context if the context is supportive, because not all contexts are made equal, and then I can come back and see the parts of the word and say, oh, I can decipher, I can understand the meaning, I can ballpark the meaning of this word, brand new word that I've never seen before, because I know the meaning of some of the parts and I can apply it, and it always works for me. That's how you build new words. That's why this focus is not only a word, a strategy to understand the meaning of a word, but it helps you learn new vocabulary. Because now I know parts, I know how the context supports me, and so forth.
And what you're saying also is parts, and also using my primary language. Maybe that primary language can help me, because I shared this example in San Diego when my husband learned German, not in school. He didn't do well in high school with it, but he learned it later when he moved and lived there. And then he's been trying to learn Spanish as well. So I can't remember the situation, but for some reason, I think we're going to the store and we're going to buy milk. And he asked me, well, what is that word in Spanish? And I said, leche. And he said, oh, well, that makes sense. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, because in German, it's and I'm probably not saying this correctly, milch. So what he did, he said milk, milk, milk. So immediately used all of his languages and all that resource of the languages that he knew came together. So when I said milk was leche, he said, right. His brain went to the German. Milk, leche. Yeah. Do you see how that works? Then he started doing it all the time, and I said, just stop already. Okay? Because I can't do that. So here we go. Vocabulary. Somebody said this. You said this. Yes, that we do need explicit instruction with Tier 2 for English learners because they might not be defined by the text. Somebody else said this. Cognates as a rich linguistic resource. And then having teachers bring attention to the morphological cues. I think we talked about all of that. So here's the example that Debbie was giving. Creatividad, creativity. So knowing that idad means ITY. Okay? Ready? We good?
Okay.
So moving to that
So
vignette.
we're going to the vignette, and here's your purpose for reading the vignette. And if you know, how many of you are familiar with the vignettes? And I'll pass them to you. It's the blue handout coming your way. How many of you are familiar with the vignettes? So you know there's a difference between the vignettes and the snapshots. And the snapshots are very to the point. They're more like a summary, a scenario, whereas the vignette is the whole story. So what I'd like you to do right now, before you start reading, I'd like you to letter off, because it's not number off, A's and B's. So we'll start with here. Okay. She's in the back, your A. Back. And she's B.
B.
And A. Raise your hand if you're an A. And then people look like, okay, she's A. I do that all the time. I actually, when it's number off, I have to hold the number in my hand or write it down because I'm going to. So if you're an A, you're going to read the vignette with this purpose in mind. So this is the lens. Find examples of intentional language development in the vignette. Intentional language development. So you're A, you're finding examples of intentional. So that's the lens you're reading with. That's your purpose for reading the vignette. If you're a B, you're going to find examples of intentional supports for English learners. In addition to supports for language development, supports for English learners. So scaffolding, this planned scaffolds for English learners. Okay? And then all of us, I didn't do it this time.
I know.
All of us are going to read this vignette and look at the strategy or look at the practice that we see illustrated in the vignette and think about how might we use this, how might we help our colleagues use it, and how might I modify this if I'm working with a different group of students than the one in this vignette. And if you're familiar with the structure of the vignette, you have the background and the lesson context. So it tells you what happened before, who's in that class, who's sitting in front of this teacher. And then the lesson context tells you where this lesson fits in the big picture of what the teacher is trying to teach. Then you'll see what the learning target and what are the standards the teacher is addressing within this vignette, or the teachers are addressing within the vignette. Then you get the lesson excerpt, and sometimes it provides you a sample or a section of the text that the teacher is using if there's text involved. And it'll give you also the dialogue and the conversation that happens between students, among students, and sometimes between the teacher and the students. So A's, find examples of intentional language development. B, find examples of scaffolds, planned scaffolds for English learners. And all of you think about how you would use the strategies illustrated in the vignette, and I will check with you in 4 minutes. So can I hear from the A's. Raise your hand if you're an A. You're reading with the lens, looking for intentional examples of intentional support, academic language development. Academic language development, meaning all students and for English learners. So what examples did you find in, first of all, what was the vignette about? What is that what the teacher, Mrs. Massimo is trying to teach? What is the learning target? What is it that she wants the students to, what is their learning target?
Food and nutrition.
On page 1, the learning targets on.
In
Thank
a
you.
short text about agribusiness and engage in collaborative conversations about the text.
Thank you. So they will unpack the meaning, which is another way of saying that they will comprehend a text, and they are using close reading. It's a close reading of this text. Thank you. So what are some of the intentional academic language development in this vignette or in this lesson? Please.
Intentional grouping.
Intentional grouping. Right? That helps both. Is an example of A is an example of scaffolds for students, right? And it's planned. What's another A? What's another example of intentional?
Prior learning.
Assessing prior learning. What's another intentional academic development? What is intentional about the academic language development? Yes. Modeling. Modeling for the students because of the class that, right, who's in that class. Some of those students in the class description, I would say they're at risk or if they are long-term English learners because they've been here for a while and they're still at that level of proficiency. Yes, you. Yes, please.
She gave them guided reading questions so that they have a specific focus when they're reading the excerpt so they're not going crazy with some of their ideas. So she kept it kind of in a box for their 3 questions here.
So you've narrowed the scope. You give them a purpose for reading so they're not all over the place. They focus on what the content, the learning target, right? Who is this about? What's going on? Any other examples of intentional supports for English learners? Yes.
She refined the students' thinking during the discussion part. So when the kids asked questions, she goes, well, what's a word in this example? What would that word be? And that's where she came in with the agribusiness and went deeper into that concept.
So instead of telling, engaging the students and negotiating that language and accepting the language, right? So, and building on. Any other examples? Yes, in the back.
She has the triads get together before they have like more of a class response time. The triads are allowed to unpack questions, discuss their notes, just so that language learners have a chance of even participating at the grander level.
Right, so there's this opportunity for students to rehearse language with each other before they're asked to use that language with a large group. Any other examples? And I know we don't do the vignettes justice by going over them so quickly, but I hope that you have a taste of what's in the vignettes and how they can be used. I'm actually using them in another capacity. I'm working with principals, and I'm working with coaching some principals on looking for evidence that teachers are planning instruction together, and what would that look like in the classroom when you're deciding what to teach and looking at assessments together. And we're actually looking at the vignettes through that lens. So there's a lot of layers of information in the vignettes. So the last question I have for you, and it's going to be like a ticket out the door, but I'm not going to collect the ticket out the door. So it has to do with that last one. And I'm going to broaden that to the entire discussion we had today, either based on what you saw in this vignette or on our discussion today about the role of academic language development and the importance of academic language development for all students and Amplify for English Learners. What is one thing you're taking back and sharing, doing in your classroom or sharing with others? So think for a moment. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for the level of energy and engagement even after lunch, when I know the blood is fighting the way back to the brain because it's around our stomachs. And I tremendously appreciate your presence today and your participation. So thank you.